A rock thrown at you still hurts regardless if you are 10 years old or 100 years old, if you're born in medieval times or in the 21st century. Welcome back to War Thunder and welcome to the tank review on the T-55A, which is currently the highest battle rating Soviet medium/main battle tank and also the end of the line tank. It features a well-known variant of the D10T 100mm gun. It goes back to its roots after the T62 in the tech tree, but it combines the best of the previous tanks in terms of armament, mobility, protection, and shell selection, and also combines that with a gun stabilizer that is really fun on this tank. I will let you everything know that there is that is important and also certain nice details on this tank. Also, you'll see some arcade and also realistic battle gameplay in the background, and I will round it up with a commented gameplay at the end. So, do I like this tank? What is it like and what to expect from this tank? Well, basically, it looks very similar to the T-54 1949. It practically doesn't bring anything completely new to the table that you haven't experienced in previous tanks, but it gives it a nice touch at the end of the day. And I think the greatest advantage that you have in realistic battles is, and I still stick with it, that you don't have to face other Russian tanks, because this tank is not as enjoyable in arcade as I thought it would be after I played it very successfully in RB. So let's get right on it with the tank review, and let's begin with the Armour. So, as usual, the frontal upper plate and the lower plate are very similar to the T62 and also to the previous two T-54s, with the exception of the T-54-47, obviously. The upper plate, 100mm at 60 degrees, the only real APHE rounds that can reliably penetrate this tank are the stock shell from the T-10M, if you play arcade, or the German 128mm APHE rounds from the Maus, the Jagdtiger, the E100, and even the Sture Emil. Same goes for the lower plate. But if you change your elevation of the tank overall a little bit, if you shoot the upper plate from this angle, it will not go through, but even more reliably go through the lower plate, and also the other way around. Don't shoot the lower plate, but shoot the upper plate. For hash rounds, all hash rounds will in theory penetrate, but the 90mm has its issues. It is a lot like based on RNG a little bit, which is very surprising. It's either penetrate or no. It's either penetrate and do full damage or no penetration at all. Especially if hash hits those add-on structural steel bits, of which you have quite many on the lower plate and also some on the upper plate. The hash effect is drastically reduced. And also you're practically AAA safe, and yeah, APDS mostly should go through, but sometimes you have those weird non-penetrations. The side armor is 80mm on the most parts of the side armor from the beginning up until the end of the side, so you have full side protection with 80mm. So that means two things. First of all, your engine deck is, or your engine compartment is not weaker, unlike on a lot of American tanks. And then you still have this just 20mm thick belly armor, I'd say, so you can get shot here by AAA and they will successfully penetrate here. Same goes for every other tank in that game. Then you can see that the turret is wider than the actual hull. That means that a little part of the side armor had to be bent out to give room for the turret ring. And this also means that when you're angling, this is a potential weak spot for APHE rounds or APDS. Hash obviously will get absorbed by the structural steel. Boxes for tools and personal things for the crew, I guess. Also those those mud guards are not modeled here, but the tracks will also absorb hash. And 80mm means that with the 30% interaction rule, all full caliber sized rounds with a caliber from 104mm and upwards will have a lot of potential of not bouncing, so the chance of bouncing is drastically reduced, but they still need to have the necessary penetration to go through. Talking about penetration and going through, the engine deck here is here on those parts surprisingly strong with 45mm, and the rest is 30mm. That is not bad at all, but 30mm means, especially for the turret front, if you get hit by a big hash shell, so from 105mm and upwards, including the 120mm hash rounds from the British, but also 120mm HE rounds from all nations. They have over 30mm of penetration and will splash down, and that has disastrous consequences, as we'll see in a moment. Then let's talk about the turret, and the turret is more similar to the T-54 1949 than to the T-62s or the T-54 1951 turret when we talk about the cupolas. First of all, the gun mantle, don't shoot it, even with ATGMs, you know, you're taking your chances. This is heavily angled, 200mm plus. We also have slight overlays here. Then the turret front itself is 200mm thick. Let's zoom in a little bit, and we can see that despite having here 15 degrees of angling, you suddenly go up to 222mm of effective thickness. This is cost homogeneous armor, so it's not rolled homogeneous armor, so technically it should have an armor reduction value or a quality multiplier of 0.9. Some also say 0.94. My testing always shows 0.9 for cost homogeneous armor. So that means technically you should be able to penetrate even here with 225mm of penetration. But you know, Russian armor, it's quite tricky. Then those machine gun holes and this viewport are no real weak spots. Yeah, it is a tricky shot. So just here you can penetrate, and here you can penetrate with the long 88 APHE round. This is quite of a standard argument for lower tiered vehicles, and when they get up tiered or they are getting dragged into higher battle rating in a fail platoon or even in a lineup. So the gun mantle, do not shoot here. This is a penetrate zone. This is a maybe zone. You can see it changes numbers quite fast. This side here, let's talk about the overall shape of the turret. It's a half sphere, so to speak. 160mm, still hash safe by pure penetration if it doesn't splash down. So for example, if you get hit in the side, then this is still safe from 105mm, and this is still safe from 90mm hash rounds. And this is in theory not 90mm hash round safe. Again, this is now the question if it can penetrate here more or less reliably. It's just cost homogeneous armor, so I wouldn't really recommend shooting hash here. Maybe between the tracks, you know, that is always a safe call if you can hit reliably here. So if you hit the tracks or those structural steel boxes, they absorb the hash effect. The rear of the turret is also ranging from 130 to 95 to just 66mm. Also, it's a rather flat and huge target from the rear. Talking about huge targets, a lot of the areas here are very well angled, and in the roof, well, technically you could begin to fantasize about overmatch mechanics, but it doesn't really work. What works are the rather big cupolas, just 100mm thick, especially the left one is quite prominent. Yeah, then let's talk about the X-ray, and first let's talk about the crew. We have our standard Soviet lineup of crew members, three on the right side, so the driver, the gunner, and the commander, obviously sitting here in one line. So if you shoot the upper part of the upper frontal plate with heat round or APDS and you penetrate when he doesn't angle, you kill three of the crew members, and that is in realistic and instant kill. In when you shoot the left side, you have those two fuel tanks, to which I will come later on because they are rather special, and this normal fuel tank. So if you shoot right central, you will hit at least two fuel tanks and also kill the loader. Then also the gun with the gun breech is quite prominent, and the gun breech gets damaged with practically every penetrating hit that you receive. Same goes for the horizontal aiming drive. Next you have the engines together with the transmissions and the radiators in the back of the vehicle. Then let's talk about the ammunition, and this is quite amusing. So overall you just have 43 rounds of ammunition, and that is not too much compared to a lot of the other medium/main battle tanks at your battle rating or slightly lower. In the turret you have 7 rounds. One is already registered as being in breach, so remove 6 of them and the turret is empty, which will still give you 37 rounds of ammunition. But I found out that somewhere between 15 to 20 rounds is mostly enough, either because you die before that anyway, or the battle is over because the Russian team again crushed Leopard drivers. But where are the rest of the shells? Well, that is a good question. Where is the frontal ammo rack? Normally there is a big prominent ammo rack. Well, it is still there. But here there are the fuel tanks. Well, you know, Americans have a wet ammo rack and they use water. Russians use fuel. If it works, I don't know. So I guess this is best use of room, I guess. And this ammo rack will get emptied last. Then you also have those ammo racks on the side. Those 2 rounds here, and also a big pack of ammunition under the commander seat in front of the engine. So it's a very fun tank to look at. But I think that's enough with the review. Let's talk about other aspects. For example, the mobility. The mobility of the T-55A is nothing spectacular, like for example the Leopard or the Type 74, but it's still very decent and overall right in the middle of the pack, especially in this comparison. I mostly focused on comparing it to the end of the line tanks that I have myself, fully spaded for ace crews obviously, and we can see that the T-55A has, together with its predecessor the T-62, the weakest engine out of them all. Especially the Leopard A1A1 and the Type 74 have 830 horsepower engines, so that's quite a difference. But it's not that bad because it is actually the lightest of the tanks in this comparison. The T-62 is 1 and the Type 74 is 2 tons heavier. And especially the weight of the Leopard A1A1 drastically reduces the horsepower to ton ratio of the Leopard A1A1 in comparison. So the T-55A's 16.1 horsepower to ton ratio is not all that bad, and as it always felt in the battles, as it always felt just driving around, it is feelable better than the M60A1's AOS 15.8 and also the predecessors, the T62. The difference is not all that great, 2.2 and 2.7% difference, but it always felt a little bit better. It might be the hidden ground resistance stats, and you know, that is just something that you really can feel. There are sadly no numbers available, but I think overall, surprisingly enough, when I always had to drive into battles, into the cap circles together with T10Ms, they were not really slower. Talking about slower, you are with a top speed of 50 kilometers an hour, again somewhere actually quite in the middle. So the M60 is a bit slower, the Leopard obviously on paper faster, and you are the same speed as the T62 and the T10M. But the Chieftain is really much slower, and the Type 74 is just a dish faster with its top speed. So how does the tank actually drive on the battlefield? What's its real speed? On most terrain, which is mostly medium, you are looking at 37 to 40, and very often also near your top speed, kilometers an hour, so somewhere between 35 and 45 kilometers an hour is nothing uncommon, fully spaded that is. Stock, the tank is, yeah, acting like a heavy tank, you really feel it, but rather a mobile heavy tank, especially when we compare it to the T10M. The reverse speed is actually joint worst with the T62. Just minus 7 kilometers an hour is not really good, especially when we compare it to the Leopard A1A1s and also the Type 74. They completely outclass it in this respect. But I think the major drawback in terms of maneuverability is the combination of the rather lackluster reverse speed and the lack of neutral steering for all Russian tanks. So that gives you quite an idea how you should see this tank. From point A to B, it acts like a medium, but in close quarters, it's rather sluggish. Talking about not so impressive stats, let's talk about the gun. And in this comparison, the 100mm D10T2S gun, a variant of the well-known D10T gun, well, in this comparison has the lowest caliber. I did not compare it to the T-95E1. But I think it becomes quite obvious that the lower caliber might indicate that you have a faster reload, but you don't. Also, the shell count is rather low, especially when you compare it to tanks such as the M60 and the Leopard, or even the Chieftain. You just lack ammunition. Now, you still have the most amongst the Soviet top tier tanks in this comparison. The reload is a little bit longer for an ace crew than on the L7 gun and its variants, aside from the Leopard, that reloads 17.4% faster, but you have a significantly faster reload than, again, the T62 and the T10M, but those are kind of massively different tanks when it comes to their gun performance. Especially a T62 fires, a APHE FSDS shell from a smoothbore gun. Keep that in mind. And the T10M is a heavy tank with a 122mm gun. So you are not the best in this class. What about other stats, such as the turret rotation speed? Well, we're deep in the reds, as you can see. 15 degrees per second for a fully upgraded tank with an ace crew is just bad. Especially when we compare it to the Russian tanks. Well, 17 degrees per second even on the heavy tank or the rather sluggish T62. That's, it still is feelable. But especially against the Chieftain, the Leopard, the M60 and the Type 74, you have between 50 and 60% longer turret traverse time. That is massive. Then there's also the gun depression, which is second worst together with the Type 74, but that has hydropneumatic suspension, which this tank doesn't have. Again, the T10M here as heavy tank has worst with minus 4 degrees. The gun elevation, again, here is 18 degrees, which again is fine. Again, the Type 74 has less together with the T10M, but again, the Type 74 can act around that with the hydropneumatic suspension. The elevation speed, again, here is better than the M60A1 AOS and also the T62, but just by half a degree per second. But more than often that's quite decisive. One last thought to the rotation speed: you have a stabilizer, and that stabilizer is very important for the overall performance of this tank. So if you want to turn your turret from your direction of view, for example, you want to aim to the left or to the right, you are bound to the 15 degrees per second. But if you get tracked when you are on the move with full speed, or you move your tank by yourself, and you want the gun to point still at the same position, it does this with the highest speed possible. So you always point the gun at the position that you want when you already point the gun at that position. That's what I want to say. So this might kind of confuse you when you experience that for the first time. So let's run through quickly certain ammunition types. The first stock round that you have is the OF412HE round. 880 meters per second muzzle velocity is not the worst, but it's not very good, and because of the low caliber nature of the shell, the penetration values are not very useful. 19 millimeters at all distances at any angle is not very useful. The second stock shell type is the 3BM8 APDS round, and that is quite something that you have on a Soviet tank, an APDS round as a stock shell. Yes, there is the T-62, but technically that's an APHE shell. So we are looking at a muzzle velocity of 1415 meters per second. Typically for APDS, that's really good, and the bounce chances are relatively low. Please notice here that 10 degrees of 100% ricochet chance and 15 degrees of 0% ricochet chance. 299 millimeters of penetration is very good at for a stock shell, and that is around about the level of the APDS round for the Leopard and all L7 gun variants, except for the M60A1 and also the Type 74's stock shell. Now the first researchable shell, which is also a tier 1 upgrade, is the BR412D, which is an APHE round, and this is kind of where the saying in the beginning comes from that a rock still hurts. Technically, APHE rounds are outdated at this kind of where the tank was developed, and a lot of countries exclusively thought about using hash and HeatFS and APDS or APFSD but I have to say, in War Thunder, where we have certain game mechanics, you know, this shell just is really good, and in the overwhelming majorities of cases I used this shell. Especially in realistic, where you have to deal with Leopards, this shell is just very good, and I prefer it over the APDS stock shell. So 887 meters per second muzzle velocity, so you really have to aim carefully, especially at longer distances. But now we have a high explosive filling with a TNT equivalent of 103.7 grams. That is less than on the German Long 88, but because there is the shell is heavier and, you know, therefore the fragments are bigger, the effect is still there. The fuse delay 1.2 meters, it's quite okay. The fuse sensitivity of 15 millimeters is excellent. Once the shell is inside the tank, it will always explode. So over penetrations, which are exclusively there for APHE rounds, will very rarely happen, except if you play in arcade and you face some lower tier potato trucks, but then I guess you will initiate hull break. 240 millimeters of penetration at 90 degrees angle of attack at close quarters, and even over 200 millimeters at 500 meters. Well, that is good enough to deal with the overwhelming majority of enemies. And if you can't deal with them, well, you still have the stock shell. So that means the stock grind on this tank is really not that bad. Just remember other tanks with kind of a solid shot in the beginning and then switching over for the first upgraded shell to an APHE round. What do you think about? Yeah, the 7.3 and 7.7 American patents, and they have substantially worse shells. For beginning on the M48, it is APCR, which is the worst shell type in the game, I guess, and then you have 170 millimeters of penetration on the APHE round. So you kind of can see that this shell is so much better and how the shells are arranged as well. The fourth shell type is the 3BM25A FSDS shell, and that is a very effective shell indeed. Like on the T-55A1, the damaging effect is bigger than on the normal APDS, at least it feels like. Master velocity 1430 meters per second. That's relatively close to the stock shell, so you do not have to retrain the leading and so on. And 335 millimeters of penetration is also not that bad. It's better than the stock shell and even better than the stock shell of the Type 74 slash the M60A1. So then there is the real oddity, that is the bouncing chances. Remember, the stock shell had 10 degrees of 100 chance of ricochet, this one has 12 degrees. But while the APDS had a 15 degree of 0% chance of ricochet, this one has 14. So it's closer together, where it always will penetrate and where it always will bounce. And then there is the last shell type. The fifth and last shell type is the 3BK17M shell, which is a HeatFS shell. Now, obviously, when you think about all other nations, they really are looking forward to their HeatFS shells. I have to say, I never felt like using it, and I think in anger I never fired a heat shell in a realistic battle or even an arcade battle. Now, there are a few reasons for it. First of all, other shell types have a better damaging effect. The AP FSDS has better damaging effect, and also the APHE round is mostly a one-shot wonder. Then there is the muzzle velocity, which is significantly lower than those of the APDS slash APFSDS shells, so it's more in the region of the APHE round than really the solid penetrating rounds. The penetration is 390 millimeters, and that will deal with any opponent. So that shell is good, but I don't think that you really need it as a Russian tank, because you don't face other Russian tanks. In arcade, I guess this shell has its place, but in realistic, you do not really have to force the grind. So especially when we look at the upgrade way, then you have to first to research the APHE round. Anyways, then you must research the 3BM25 before you can even research the 3BK17M round. So keep this in mind. So you actually can invest your research points in something else. For example, the suspension, which might come as a surprise, as the suspension makes the stabilizer more reliable, more accurate, and more useful. So now let's talk about the shell comparison compared to all the other tanks. The T-55A is next to the T-10M the only tank at higher battle rating that actually uses APHE. The HE is by far the worst in this comparison. Other nations even rely on hash with significantly high explosive penetration, if you want to interpret it that way. Then you also have the APDS, APCR, APFSDS variant, and in this respect you kind of see where the shell stands. It is better than the stock shell on the Leopards, and even better than the stock shell on the M60A1, but it is not as good as the T62's upgraded APFSDS round, and also you are very close to the performance of the T10M's APDS round. But you come nowhere near to the Chieftain, On the other hand, you still have a heat round available, and while it has the worst penetration out of all the heat rounds, it still is a very good penetrating round. And I guess at 500 meters, it even surpasses the raw penetration of the Chieftain's APDS run. The one downside that I really feel on this tank is that it doesn't have a smoke screen available, nor a smoke shell. This might get changed in the future, but for now I think it is a real drawback. So when we put all together, where does the the T-55 stand? Well, it hasn't the highest mobility, it doesn't have the highest rate of fire, there is still kind of a stock grind towards the shells, but it's not as terrible, at least if you play realistic. In arcade it's kind of lackluster, but the combination of a APHE round and also a stabilizer is really enjoyable. Then I think the T-55 is no more this frontline brawler like something that you would say about the T-54-47, and the armor isn't worth that much anymore against proper tanks, but against everything else it still holds up quite well. So we are here on Domination on Sinai, and I will actually go for the sea capture point for two reasons. First of all, it's an open area. I kind of like open area. It reminds me a lot about the area when you start from the south on Kursk on the right hand side. It seems flat, it seems open, but in fact there are a lot of ridge lines and a lot of dips and places where you can hide more or less in open sides or open field. So this point around sea is not very often contested, and if somebody is going for it, then it's just one or two enemies, and I can usually deal very well with enemies in a 1 versus 1 situation. And when you capture then sea, it's a free capture points, free silver lines, free RP, and spawn points if you really use lineups. B is very often uncontested at all. Like some tanks shoot at each other, but nobody is really going for it. That might come from the battle around A, and a lot of the tanks that are sniping from the 6/7 line. And then while they cannot kill every tank that is within A because of the village, they can for sure hit most of the tanks at B. Talking about tanks, this M48 Patton does not have a stabilizer, so he completely missed me. I hit his engine deck, but the angle was too steep to penetrate. And then watch this shot. So a lot of people complain about Russian tanks having bad gun depression and APHE being outdated. I say, at the end of the day I have my results. So the one thing that the stabilizer and the 5 degrees of gun depression might interfere each other is when you go over really rough terrain and somebody is below you, then the gun depression or rather the lack of, still kicks the gun up. So you have to take that into account depending on the terrain that you are on. Now this gameplay is really nice, but it kind of, for me, was... Well, I think at this point where I was heading to B, I already knew that I think I can have a good game because I can fall into the enemy's flank if they don't really take care of B right now. Now, if you want to see a really great gameplay in terms of kills, watch my first impressions that I just released like not even a week ago. I think I refined my opinion in this tank review. I showed much more numbers that just show you much clearer where the tank stands. The funny thing about the APHE round that I'm taking with me is that a lot of the other nations thought about pure turret armor and pure mobility rather than full armor like a lot of the Russian tanks. And I think this is where then suddenly APHE becomes kind of a gets kind of a renaissance of its usage. A shame that the Leopard doesn't have APHE. And that was a very frustrating aspect on the Leopard for me and all other L7 guns when I had to rely on the APDS, because against the major opponents slash the Russians it was always not reliable enough. The damage was not good enough and the penetration was not for certain, despite on paper I should have gotten it. A very nice kill here on the Sheridan. And I also capture another capture point. So can we make a triple in terms of capture points? Let's find out. I'm observing here the ridgeline and I get then hit by something out of this direction and I did not know what it was. And I extinguished the fire and obviously soon began to repair after a few seconds. I actually wanted to reverse back into cover, but it was not quite good enough, so I repaired. I think that the major advantage of the T-62 compared to a Leopard is that you look smarter than you actually are as a tank driver. Again, it is the combination of APHE against the opponents that you face. It's the armor that is not a pure walkover, and especially certain stop tanks might struggle here. Here you could actually see that I massively overled, but on the other hand that the enemy did not really notice where the shot came from. So a lot of Leopards don't have the benefit of the doubt, Leopard drivers. When they die, it's usually that the Leopard driver is stupid, yada yada yada. But here you could see, I'm not quite sure if I would have killed this guy with an FSDS or APDS shell. But APHE is well known to me, it fits my playstyle, I get the one-shot kill, and off I go to another capture point. And A is currently decaptured and gets captured in a few moments by my team members. I kind of try to get into that, so I then can harvest a few more points. So back to the being smarter or looking smarter than you actually are. I think the same goes for the T-10M, and a lot of other nations' tank drivers have to actually develop a pure playstyle in terms of the strength and weaknesses of their tank. For a best example, I guess, is the Chieftain. Fantastic turret armor, like a little bit the Conqueror in its overall handling, so to speak. But at the end of the day, if you expose the hull, you get one-shotted through the lower plate, especially by Russian tanks using APHE, and you look kind of stupid because you couldn't use the strength. But how can you go hull down in a city fight? How can you go hull down on Poland in the middle of the city if you go for the capture point? If you can't do that, please let me know how. This tank, however, has no real weak spot aside from the big cupolas. On the other hand, which other nation's tank uses APHE? None. So, yeah. At this point, that was the last kill. From now on in, it was just waiting for another 7 minutes, so let's cut it down. At the end, I was rocketed from the air, I respawned in the Shilka, but I didn't manage to kill something, so let's have a quick look at the post-battle results. And we can see that I got for my 4 kills and 5 kills for critical hits and 3 capture zones, 45,000 silver lines and 4,519 modification research points with 15% boosters and a premium account. So that was quite a nice result. I really like the T-55A, but it's not a very exotic tank. It just brings in something old school into a new school area, and again it looks really smarter than it is. But at the end of the day, if you can kill your opponents with a stone, why do you have the need for using a heat shell? So that's it for me today. I hope I could give you realistic expectations for this tank and showcase it to you. Let me know in the comment section what you think, and also give this video a like if you did, subscribe if you want to see more, and we'll see each other on the battlefields of War Thunder.